Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. It's great being here. It's the first time for me at Resco Next. I love seeing all of you, how you're engaged with this, and I love being here. Yeah, and I like the survey day, because basically this is the perfect introduction for myself. This session, Power Automate, it's not Power Integrate. I came basically up because I work with Power Automate a lot. It can do a lot of stuff. And basically this is kind of like I always say like it's a bit of a therapy session. So I talk about all the hard-learned lessons, the pain I experienced working with Power Automate. Basically, this is how I look a lot of the times when I work. I build something, it works, at some point I'm like, what the hell did I do there like last year? Why would I ever think this is a good idea? And often with Power Automate I get to this point. I was actually kind of like explaining that to somebody else. I'm being really frustrated about it, saying like, oh, why? Kind of like, I feel like, what did I build? It's not good. Kind of like, what did I do there? And a good friend of mine, Keith Watling, another Microsoft MVP, he actually looked at me and said, Mats, don't worry about it. If you look at your code from like last year and you're not horrified, you're not kind of like, what did I do there? That means you haven't really progressed. Looking back at it and saying like, oh, I would do it so much better now, that's a good sign. That means you learned something, you progressed, you do it differently now. And to be honest, tech is changing so fast. We see a lot of sessions today, right, where it's about how the tech is progressing. So of course, stuff you did like last year, a few years back, will be bad at some point. You have to work on that. And that leads me kind of like to thinking about the session, because what I want to talk about today is really what's the right tool for the right job. And I feel like as soon as you get to this, I think everybody working with tech has to answer that question, because you will learn a lot of different technologies to work with. Figuring out which one is the best to solve a certain challenge, that's actually, I think, the main thing you have to do. That's the biggest thing, or that will solve you a lot of these kind of like, oh, what the fuck did I do situations in the future. So we talk about that. Obviously, with Power Automate, I want to share, again, some of my pains. So everything in here is definitely something I did before. What's that? And kind of like talk about the options we have. Okay, so the right tool, right job, right? I love the Microsoft Power Platform. I've been working with it now, well, since it's been named Power Platform. And the great thing about this thing, you see here, it's great, right? There's a lot of stuff you do. And Microsoft is just adding tools and tools and tools, making it more powerful. Making it, on the one hand, harder to do things, but on the other hand, you have more and more options. And this is an older slide, and I always loved this slide when Microsoft explained what the Power Platform is or what makes it so unique. And for me, it's a platform for every type of maker. So no matter if you're kind of like a C# developer, have been doing that your whole life, if you're a maker working mostly with Excel and want to do some more stuff, Power Platform has some tools for you. And actually, I think Power Automate is one of the ones, also with my customers, kind of like the entry drug, like this, right? It's a good gateway to get into this whole Power Automate stuff, Power Platform stuff, because Power Automate, it's quite easy to get into. I would always describe it like the threshold to get into Power Automate. It's not that high. It's actually an easy tool to use, and it has a lot of flexibility. It's had a lot of power, right? And of course, then every time I mention power, with great power comes great responsibility, because if you can do a lot of stuff, you can also break a lot of stuff. So that makes Power Automate really interesting, because you can actually solve a lot of things and do great things, but you have to be a bit careful maybe, because, well, it can also go the other way really quickly. And the other part about Power Platform, which I think sets it apart from other low-code platforms, it's actually, and this is a quote from Microsoft, it offers unmatched governance and security. I always say the word offers is doing the heavy lifting in the sentence, because it's not always automatically that you get that out of it. There's a lot of box out of the box, obviously, but some of the stuff you really have to know about it, or you can use it, but it's not enforced on you. And a lot of these kind of common pitfalls we talk about is kind of like, well, use the tools you've been giving with the platform. If you ignore them, well, bad things might happen to you. But that's the thing, kind of like, because Power Automate is so easy to get into, that's something we have to educate people using Power Automate, saying like, well, yes, you can build it, but there are actually ways you can build it in a secure, governed way that is also working for the future. So with that, kind of like I want to go to some of these common things which often happen when you work with that. And so I started actually on the ERP side of things when I started my career. I was working with what was then Business Central, until I decided, well, that's a bit boring. I want to go to the sales marketing side of things. But to this day, I often work with customers who have an ERP system, a sales system, a CM system. And one of the most common scenarios I see there is this kind of, okay, we have our accounts in our ERP system, and now we want to integrate that with our sales system, right? So obviously, we want to sync the accounts there and get the quote back, kind of like to create an invoice. And this kind of scenario, it's quickly done, but it's really important, right? If you can't create invoices, that can be business critical for an enterprise really quickly. So this integration actually might be very, very important for your enterprise. And the thing why I talk about this, or why I talk about Power Automate, and I mentioned this, Power Automate has a lot of power, right? Why does it have power? Because there are a lot of connections in there. And every time I show the slide, I see some people from Microsoft in the slide, I always get shit saying, oh no, the number is actually higher nowadays, kind of like this 1,600 connections. There might be even more at this point. But the thing is, Power Automate connects to systems really well. That's what it's designed to do. That's what Power Automate is about. And they're all very different, and the number is just increasing. You can build custom connectors, another thing I like to talk about. And the thing is, with that, you would say, well, there's obviously a tool which is designed to do a lot of integrations because it connects to all the different tools. The first thing when we talk about connections, though, is how do you connect to different tools? And this is a slide you might have seen Yannick Reckman's a session tomorrow about security. How do you actually authenticate with systems? That's a whole topic on itself. Kind of like we could spend hours and hours talking about that. But the one common thing I see with Power Automate is, and this slide really reads, start from the top, saying, okay, managed identities, that's the best thing you want to use. If a connector offers managed identities, use them. It's basically Microsoft does a lot of heavy lifting for you. And then it's basically like worse. It's sadly, it's also more common, the lower you get. But basically the user account, that's kind of like you enter your username and your password and you authenticate with that. That's the most common thing used. And that's obviously, if you start as a maker on a platform, you create a flow, they will ask you, hey, log in if you want to connect to Dataverse, if you connect to Outlook, for example. And the problem with these user connections is they break very quickly. I always like, it's in here, I had a lot of customers where, for example, the license got reassigned. Somebody didn't have a Power Automate license anymore, and 14 days later, the flow starting to break. And if you think about the scenario where we used this, maybe it was the developer in that company, he created the sync for the quotes to go to invoices, and suddenly you can't invoice anymore just because a license was reassigned. That's obviously a very bad thing. The other one, if the person leaves the company. Like the positive case, they won the lottery and they don't show up to work anymore the next day. Well, you have a problem. I actually left my company end of the year to start on my own. And basically in December, a lot of things what I did was kind of like searching for flows I had built to figure out or to change the connection because I didn't want them to break when I'm in January and get a call on January 14th saying, Mats, a lot of shit is happening here. So that was actually doing a lot of that. So definitely check out these connections. And again, it's very dependent on the source where you're connecting to. But there are different options, and always if you have this username thing, think about something to do there, because that might not be the best way, or it's very, it can break very quickly. And the other one, performance and limits. Always when you talk about these two tools, and especially if it's software as a service, if some vendor is telling you, well, we have limitless, there are no limits at all, be a bit kind of like hesitant, because obviously at some point there is a computer somewhere, right? The cloud is just a computer you're renting somewhere else. So there is some physical limits at some point. And actually, the documentation for Power is getting better and better basically every day. If you look at that, there's like a lot of limits. And if you go to that, to a link, it's actually quite interesting to read through that because there were some limits, but I didn't really think about that. Kind of like, oh, this might be something. So just not going into all details, but the reading through that, it gives you some ideas. Oh, this might be common pitfalls again, because this might be something which happens. And I always like to say, if you look at the limits, it really gives you a good idea what Microsoft designed the tool to do. Because if they said the limit is this, they probably didn't think about a use case here. They thought about use cases here. So limits give you a good idea, kind of like what should you use the tool for, and like in this session, what shouldn't you use it for. And again, limits, often like that. Because especially with integrations, limits don't happen when you build the flow. They happen a year later when it's in production, and sometimes the customer is calling me and saying, Mats, nothing is working anymore, nothing is syncing, and what's happened? Oh yeah, we did like 1 million changes, something like that. Oh yeah, well, that was not really designed to do that. But in the end, limits are really protecting you, because in this multi-tenant cloud universe, you want limits. Because if you don't have any limits, this noisy neighbor, that's by the way the picture I was looking for, noisy neighbor, I hope that comes across. Basically meaning if some other company is using all the resources, you don't get them, or you will have less performance, even though you pay for that. So that's why limits are very important, not just for the vendor, but actually for you as a customer, because they guarantee you that you have this service level kind of agreement. You know, this is what I get, and I get that guaranteed. That's why you want limits. But, I don't know, if you build flows, if you ever thought about limits, kind of building them, to be honest, I only started that doing after some of these lessons I learned the hard way. Because if you look again at the documentation, limits are very dependent on what license you use. So again, licensing is never a fun topic, but if you build these mission critical flows, think about what license do I actually use, because the license will define your performance, and it will also define what limits you have. And if you look on the image on the left-hand side there, you see there are some limits. And if you use like the very small licenses, you don't get a lot of requests, basically. And a request is basically each box you have in a flow. Each time this is triggered, it's a request. And that can, obviously, with integrations, spiral up very quickly. So make sure that you have this in mind, because for a lot of integrations, this might not be a problem. But my experience is, especially if it's like a very mission business critical integration, you don't want that to be limited by these limits, because there might be someday again, oh, maybe today we had all these account changes. We needed to sync them, and we can't wait for that. Have that in mind when using Power Automate for this. Because, and I mentioned that before, this overload by external source. So this is the flow we built, and I love this HTTP trigger in Power Automate, right? It basically gives you an URL you can send a payload to, and then the flow runs with that payload. It's very great. We use it a lot of times with external vendors, saying, well, if some event happens in your system, just send it to this URL, and we do stuff with that. Here you see like a very typical flow we built like that. Kind of like you get the result, and it might be one account or multiple accounts, and then you go through the steps. Usually you do something like, I want to pass the JSON, because I want to work with the JSON in the flow. That's one step. I want to transform the JSON. Okay, next step. I want to check, do I already have that account in my Dataverse or not? Next step. Then I want to either create it or not. 2 steps, actually. And with one record coming in, well, that's like 6 steps in here. But if you look at that, if it's like 100 or 10,000, especially the loop thing gets your requests up really quickly. And if you compare that to the limits you have, well, you can reach those limits very quickly. And if you reach the limits, let me tell you, that's not a fun thing to do. Again, this customer was giving me the call, saying, oh yeah, we updated our whole ERP, and I don't know, they set a flag on all the accounts. And that triggered the integration for all the accounts. And it basically took me like a week to clean that up afterwards, because flows were being throttled. There were a lot of errors in there. I didn't even know which account did trigger it or not. That was kind of like, okay, some stuff happened. So it was really annoying. And again, obviously, what did I look like? Like that again. There were some errors, and I was like, oh, why do I work in IT? It's like, so why do I do this? So error handling is the next thing. When you work with Power Automate, again, out of the box, there's a lot of stuff. And if you look at this flow again, if you work at this, it works. It looks like this. You're like, yes, job is done. Everything is working. I have the logging here, right? So it's Power Automate does take care of that. Everything is good. Yeah, that works until it looks like this. And you're like, oh, well, okay, maybe now there is some kind of error. What do I actually do about it? And again, here, by the way, I took the screenshot by design with this 2 weeks in there, because these 2 weeks, with a lot of Power Automate, you hit limits in 2 weeks. For example, if your flow has too many errors, Microsoft will just turn it off at some point. If your flow has too many errors, Microsoft will throttle your flow and then turn it off again. So having errors in there is definitely something where you need to do something. You can't just say, well, there are some errors, but well, they send it the next day again. It's fine. If you have errors, that's kind of like a bad sign, and Microsoft is really looking for these signs, and they might really turn your flows off. Again, something which I know because that happened to me. So think about active error handling, and there are a lot of ways to do that. The simplest, I think, trick so far is using the scope action. That's the brown action, the brown box. Think of it, if you're from a product background, like a try-catch thing, saying like, okay, try these actions if something happens, do that. Or think about like a group. Basically, you can group different Power Automate actions together, and then you can actually do something like saying like, I want to do something if something failed. So by default, all these actions kind of like they trigger when the previous action was successful. Then the action triggers. You can actually control that. If you go on there saying like, oh, this action should only trigger if there was an error or a timeout, like all the negative things. And then you're saying like, okay, if that happens, in this case, like send out an email, or you have some other logging system you're using. Especially, I mentioned user accounts are a bad thing, right? Well, who gets the automatic email notifications? The owner. But if you don't have a user account anymore, those might go to some service account inbox where nobody checks it. So having a bit of more control who gets actually error messages, it's a great thing to do. Okay, I want to leave you with a bit kind of like, because again, Power Automate is great, right? There are a lot of use cases where Power Automate is super awesome to do that. But again, there are some cases where maybe Power Automate is not the right tool. And I love the saying, like, if the only thing you have a hammer as a tool, everything looks like a nail, right? You start hammering a lot of stuff which should not be hammered in the first place. So talking about kind of what other options are there. And the one thing I always recommend here is using queues. And for example, here it's the Azure Service Bus. So this is an Azure product. You don't have that in your license with Power Platform, but it costs like 10 euros per month, the basic version, and you get a lot of that. And the basic idea is here that instead of having this trigger, they send it to a URL, we just send it to the service bus first, and the service bus triggers the flow. which sounds very similar, but basically it decouples the two systems. Because now we can put a lot of things in a queue. That's what a queue is designed to do. It can handle literally millions of records in short amounts. And then the flow can kind of like slowly work on this queue, get these records out of there. And for example, with this 1.5 million cases, I could also go at some point and say, okay, please delete the queue. Those are obviously like not, I want to clean that up. But basically it protects your services. It decouples them and you don't kind of like have this load or overload directly in your system. The other thing, and I talked about limits, also give you an idea what Power Automate was designed. I don't know who invented Power Automate, but I would wager they never invented it to make mass data transfers from one system to the other. Because Microsoft has a lot of other tools who do that very well. One of them, and this is something you have in your licenses if you have premium licenses, it's Power Platform data flows. And they are designed to literally millions of records, move them across. You can do that on a schedule, you can do it manually, and from the UI-wise, it's really simple. If you work with Power BI, it looks very similar. Then again, one of my favorite slides here, and obviously with Resco, and I think all of you know this already, because there are some things which are really hard, but there are other companies who specialize on solving that, right? We all know that's why we're here with Resco, right? The same for integrations. Like there are a lot of third-party vendors who have great integration tools and have great experience with that. In my opinion, it's very well to pay them to get that, because otherwise you will sit like me in front of the laptop, learn these lessons, build that over years, or you just pay somebody to do that, basically. And also, it gives you a lot of ideas what to do with integrations. Yes, and with that, I basically want to leave you. I can talk a lot about Power Automate, so if you have any questions, please feel free. I'm around here today and tomorrow to ask questions. Maybe the last thing kind of like I want to leave you with, when you build integrations, basically step 0 when you build a new integration, really think about, do I actually need to build an integration? Because the best integration, the best way to avoid all this is not to integrate systems. Maybe you find a different way. For example, like with Power BI, do I really need that data in that other system, or do I just need a dashboard kind of like referencing a different system? Do I need to copy that? Dataverse has virtual tables. So think about all the kind of like the ways around that. Is the integration, again, I have the integration tool. Is the integration tool really the right thing? Obviously, we need to integrate systems, but there are different ways of doing that.